Hey, what's up? We're going to talk about the anime I watched last season. I thought it would be interesting to give them actual scores. We'll talk a bit more about why I'm doing that later in the video, but we've got a lot to cover, so I'm just going to get into it. Starting off on kind of a low note with Kimono Friends Season 2. This went from being a much anticipated sequel to a much dreaded one. If you don't know, Kadokawa, the company that owns the Kimono Friends brand, broke ties very publicly and ugly with Tatsuki, the director of Season 1, and the animation studio that he worked with for it. And Season 2, very, very much hurt by his absence. Pretty much all of my worst fears about it were confirmed. They tried to replicate the really unique, idiosyncratic video animation style of the original that has these like really kind of flat, simply textured 3D models moving around somewhat awkwardly. But it falls into this really weird uncanny valley now where they weren't really able to replicate Tatsuki's cinematography. And thus they have like very conventional anime style framing and kind of scene, mise-en-scene structuring, but with these kind of janky models giving us a real worst of both worlds. And it seems like they were deliberately trying to replicate some of the kind of jankier or more idiosyncratic and strange movements and developments. And that goes for the pacing and the plot and the structure of the show too. It all seems very, very deliberately trying to capture the successes of the original in a way that's just very transparent. It's a shame because the first season was appealing largely because it was so mysterious and inexplicable. You really weren't sure why these choices were being made, if they were done out of budgetary concerns or if there was some real stylistic intent. But now all of that confusion is gone and it's replaced with this brutal capitalist reality. And it's like, I didn't dislike everything about the show, too, and that almost made it more painful, is that a lot of the basic premise still persists, and I love the premise. I love the setting, I love these characters, I love the voice acting, I love just the idea of it in the most basic sense. So I still found myself enjoying aspects of it, but it always just seemed off. It never seemed anywhere near the appeal of the original. Um, so I'm going to give it a 4 because, as I said, there are things I like about it, but I just can't be happy that it was made. I can't give it a passing grade because in the end, I wish they had just left well enough alone and said, all right, well, if we're getting rid of Tatsuki, then we simply can't pursue this project anymore. But it's about the money. They just wanted the money. So, I don't know. If you're a diehard Kimono Friends fan, I assume you've probably already checked it out and given your opinion on it. But for those of you that don't really know about this whole phenomenon, just watch the first season, see if it appeals to you, but don't feel any need to continue past that point. Um, I'd say my favorite part of this, the thing I'm most grateful for it for, is that it really allowed me to understand the appeal even better of Tatsuki's new show, Tatsuki Kusa. Here, Tatsuki throws out everything that made Kimono Friends appealing and is telling a completely different story in a completely different setting, one that's very alien and foreign, where Kimono Friends relied on a very universal reference base of animals. Here we really have nothing to kind of contextualize us, nothing that we can relate to immediately. But it has a lot of the same charm as Kimono Friends because of that. That so much of the series we're just asking, like, why? Like, why is this being emphasized? Is this actually going to pay off somewhere in the plot? Or is this just kind of some strange quirk of the screenwriting that we can't possibly hope to understand? I've said before often that playing Kimono Friends was like going to Blockbuster as a kid and picking out some bizarre 3D platformer that you'd never heard of and finding it all very weird and mysterious and possibly poorly translated or something. This is a similar feeling, but instead of a 3D platformer for the PlayStation 1 or whatever, You're getting like a bizarre freeware indie game from some dilapidated geocities.jp site. Like it has that kind of Yume Nikki-esque appeal where you feel like you're almost seeing something haunted or cursed, and yet that's balanced at the same time with Tatsuki's very strange, very goofy sense of humor that, in this regard, actually really reminds me of Final Fantasy, specifically like Final Fantasy VII or the PS1 era Final Fantasy games. It took me a while to really pinpoint why I was constantly being reminded of it. But I think the kind of humor where, kind of distressing and tragic things are happening around you, and there's action and tension and loss and grief, awkwardly segueing into just like very character driven sort of bantery humor where you kind of lean back on some quirky characteristics of your cast. Really kind of reminds me of how those games are tonally structured, that they often have these bizarre comic relief moments. And even the way it's animated reminds me a lot of those cutscenes, where you have like a lot of characters kind of standing around at once, which is different than most anime, where you're mostly focusing on close-ups and you're having kind of tight framing, because the more characters you have on screen, the more effort it is to animate all of them, or the more awkward it is when you leave them unanimated. But for a 3D modeled show like this, they don't have that problem, so they really can kind of just cram the whole cast on screen whenever they want. And often in the background, they're all just kind of like making idle animations or tossing in like random quirks, or random quips, sorry, or shouts of support or whatever. It's I think it really comes across as the same sort of conversational style as those games. Like I could even picture like the Final Fantasy IX-esque message bubbles popping up in a lot of these scenes. Also, the way that the non-conversational scenes are shot. There's some really beautiful moments of them just exploring this world, where it's like a long static shot of a background that the characters just kind of slowly move through. And that reminded me a lot of the pre-rendered backgrounds and such of those PS1 era Final Fantasy games, where you're looking at the same background that's not moving or anything, and your character just moves through, and you're like kind of wondering what is going to be interacted with, where you're going to end up going. It had that same kind of yearning for me. Like it tapped into a kind of curiosity that I think was really bolstered by playing those games as a kid, and has really persisted somewhere deep inside of me now. The soundtrack is fantastic too. All the sound effects, just perfect, really kind of situating yourself in this completely alien aesthetic, and yet such a consistency across the entire aesthetic that you're able to kind of predict and see the connections between things, such that when there's twists, you at least have kind of an aesthetic base to understand what is happening, just based on the colors or the shapes of what emerges. Is this a threat? Is this a friendly? I don't know, little things like that. It really kind of makes it a much more cohesive experience, which is necessary when everything about it is so weird. Like Kimono Friends, the action parts seem really kind of unnecessary. I guess there needs to be some sort of urgency to kind of balance the plot tonally. There needs to be some sense of distress, and the kind of loss that the characters have suffered gives them a bit more emotional depth. But I would prefer to see something a little more existential, something more just kind of haunting and strange, rather than straight up fighting against gigantic bug robot creatures with punches and kicks and stuff like that. That doesn't really excite me too much. There are a few action scenes that are so well done that I still kind of applaud them and found myself invested in them. But this is, like Kimono Friends before it, an extremely low budget show. And this is where it really shows, is in these action scenes. Near the end especially, there's some that are just very blatantly unfinished. And where like a character is just running and there's a whole bunch of sound effects happening, and you can tell that they recorded dialogue as if they were going to animate more, but they just didn't have a chance. It's quite unfortunate, and to some extent, it actually kind of makes the show more charming and quirky. But it also really detaches you from it and kind of ruins any sort of immersion that you might have had based on the plot and the emotional significance up until that point. So overall, though, I'm very, very happy with it. I was really not sure what to expect. And the fact that I had expectations at all made me kind of worried because I had no idea what Kimono Friends would be like, and really was kind of blown away by the whole experience of watching that. So I thought going into this and already being familiar with that, it would kind of put a damper on it. But no, it was able to replicate that feeling yet again. So I would give this an 8. I'd say if it was polished up more, if it had a little more excitement in certain parts, or just abandoning the hope for exciting action sequences in the first place and just sticking with that kind of dreadful alien feeling, it could have elevated itself even further. But as it stands, I think it's a solid 8. Next show we'll talk about is End Row. This is a fun little slice of life series that parodies classic JRPGs like Dragon Quest and such. We have our legendary hero, who finds the hero's sword and is thus tasked with killing the Demon Lord. Little does she know that the Demon Lord is actually their school teacher. It's all based on a convoluted time travel shenanigans plot that kind of emerges throughout the episodes. It's somewhat deliberately confusing and jarring, and even feels a little bit like fourth wall breaking in the early episodes when they frantically try to catch you up to what's going on. But it's a lot of fun, and most of that stuff doesn't really matter. Like a lot of these slice of life shows, I'm most unhappy when they're taking their premise too seriously and really kind of focusing on that, and much more excited by just establishing some fun characters in a fun setting and just kind of going loose with it. Speaking of loose or yuru, the character designs are by Namori, who did Yuri Yuri, and I think it's a big strength of the show is just how well done and appealing the characters are. All the voice acting is great. I especially like Chino-chan from Gochiusa plays this really like nerdy girl, and it's like such a perfect fit that I'm seeing that voice now as her rather than Chino-chan. Seeing that voice, hearing that voice more as her than as Chino-chan now, which is surprising. The animation isn't really much to speak of. It's by the same studio that did Tonari no Kuketsuki-san last season, or the season before this, My Neighborhood Vampire, which also had like, yeah, pretty minimal animation, but it didn't really need it because it was pure slice of life. Here, because it's slice of life mixed with this kind of fantasy action, sometimes those sequences are pretty bland. Things just kind of happening, and again, this is what I'm saying, that I don't really like them taking their premise too seriously. I kind of wish, though, that if this was like a higher budget studio, those sequences I think had the potential to be like really enthralling and really fun, kind of like Mahojin Guru Guru a year or so ago, which had the same sort of blend of slice of life and fantasy action, but really nailed the fantasy action parts. Really brought them into their own style and actually put a lot of love into them. Whereas here, it kind of feels like the same amount of effort is being put into the fantasy sequences as just the characters sitting around chatting. Which, on the positive side, makes this character sitting around chatting scenes pretty darn good. And they know how to play their strengths with the animation. There's like a lot of close-ups, and they really focus on making sure that there's not off-model or laziness in those close-ups. So you're just kind of seeing cute characters saying cute things most of the time, and really that's pretty much all you want from anime. So I would give this a 7. It's good enough. I don't know. It's no masterpiece, but it's not something that you'll ever disappoint yourself by watching. Next we'll talk about Mob Psycho 100 Season 2. Oh my gosh. This one, my expectations were sky high for. I thought Bones did an amazing job with Season 1, really bringing out every kind of animation style you could dream of. in order to take one's extremely simple, sketchy artwork and just pull it in every direction imaginable, allowing the really strong emotional core of the series to explode in all sorts of different animation styles. And I don't know, man. You've probably seen it. Isn't it great? Whenever they bust out the pastels, whenever they bust out the computer graphic effects, whenever they bust out the sketchy pencil line work, like it all just so perfectly replicates the subjective experience of the characters, and that's something that anime, I think, should aspire to as a medium. That's one of its unique qualities, is this total bending of the visual component to the emotional needs of the scene. It's so cool. And season 2 exceeds on with flying colors in all of those regards. Perhaps even going further. Some of the animated sequences in this series are just mind-boggling to me that they could even be done. Some of my favorite fight scenes in all of anime, just in terms of the sheer creativity in their choreography and their depiction. Um, all of that just exceeding my already outrageously high expectations from season 1. But then the plot, too, I think really hits its stride here. They really leaned into adaptations of, in the manga, what were kind of like longer arcs, like maybe something around the length of a volume. I was kind of worried about how they were able to cram it all into just a 13 episode series, given what I assumed would be the end point of this season. But they did a fantastic job kind of taking those arcs and making them into 2 episode mini arcs. And I think the fact that it was 2 episodes, unless they could find kind of the middle point of the arc, like that turning point, um, and whatever sort of pacing issues they anticipated, all they knew is that they had to land that first episode ending to kind of hook you, and then they had the whole second half of the episode, or the second episode, to kind of resolve things and to give you every kind of climax you wanted at this sort of unhurried pace. So I think it's an absolute genius move of structuring that they're able to tell these fairly complicated stories, like the possession story and the whole Reagan fall and redemption story, and all of these things that, like, they have quite a lot of moving parts and quite a lot of things that need to be explained and developed. But I just, I don't know. I was enthralled with this kind of like cinematic feeling the entire time. And then from there, really smoothly transitioning into one of the largest, if not the largest, arcs in the entire series, the gigantic showdown against the Claw organization. That feeling of kind of breaking out of the 2 episode arc pattern felt extremely powerful too, because it seemed like now anything was possible, that they were going to just push further and further in this direction. And even though I already had read the manga, even though I already knew everything that was going to happen, I still felt myself caught up in anticipation with the story, just to see to what extent each thing would be pushed within each given episode. Like, I don't know, very, very impressive. The storytelling, of course, just wonderful, with a great emotional core and kind of moral center. An extremely lovable cast of characters that you just can't help but root for. Um, I don't know, man. I really can't praise it enough. It's so good. Um, there's an episode near the start too that has some of my favorite dog animation in all of anime. When Reagan is washing the dog and stuff, just the love put into animating that dog, I think, speaks for the quality of the show in totality. So this gets a 9. That's an easy 9 for me. Next is another show I was very impressed with, Zoku Owari Monogatari. I've heard mixed things about the future of this series with Shaft after this. I know that we're only like at the halfway point, or maybe the 2/3 point, in terms of actually adapting the novels. There's still a lot of novel content out there. And Shaft at one point did promise that they would adapt the entire series come hell or high water. But then I also read a comment suggesting that a lot of the chief animation staff at Shaft that had been working on these projects have left. And that there's a lot of other kind of circumstantial evidence that they're going to stop after Zoko Owari Monogatari. And it is kind of concerning that they haven't announced the next project after this. And it is kind of a logical point to stop, even though there are more novels that just directly continue the story. This is the end of one of the seasons of novels. And there is kind of a feeling of, well, things will just kind of go on after this, but we might not be with those characters, which is concerning for me because I love this franchise. I love Shaft's take on it. It's one of my favorite series of all time, so I'd love to see more. But if this was the ending point, I guess maybe I would be a little disappointed. I don't want to spoil too much for those of you out there that are planning on watching this franchise at some point but haven't yet. But I guess I would just say that this serves less as like grand finale and more as kind of like post-game stuff. And with the way that the original Owari Monogatari ended, I guess that shouldn't be too much of a surprise. But in terms of the love that they gave it, it's not really at all a disappointment or at all a step down from any of the more kind of climactic series. It still has Shaft's wonderful iconographic depiction style, where every little conversation and explanation breaks into completely aesthetic and format busting circumstances. Like this screenshot alone is a great example. I think Shaft's ability in doing so has just been improving and improving. And even in ones where it's just kind of like a throwaway thing, if you actually pause and think about all of the design choices and all of the effort to make them just completely perfect for that little 3-second clip, Shaft is still here, totally unparalleled. The plot is pretty goofy and pretty strange. The characterization, I mean, I don't really know how to speak about it without really ruining the premise. But it's all over the place, and after spending over a decade kind of becoming familiar and really endeared to these characters, it was a lot of fun to see them in this way, even if it kind of lacked the big dramatic payoff that it could have had with more consistent, I guess I would say, characterization. The setting is a lot of fun in that same regard too. It kind of gave me like a Toho feeling. And again, I don't know if I can explain this too well without spoiling big parts of the plot, but just the kind of way that the characters moved around and interacted and the size of the cast in this one gave me some really good kind of Toho vibes. And I would love to see them go even further in that direction. And I think Toho, as a setting, is particularly ripe for this type of depiction, where there are no lines that can't be crossed in terms of aesthetic breaking or characterization tangents or anything like that. Fantastic. Overall, I'm really exceedingly happy with it. So I would also give it a 9. Not my absolute favorite section of the Monogatari anime, but still holding its own. Still really nothing to complain about. Another fantastic entry in this really, really fantastic franchise. Okay, so we have one more show to talk about. But before that, I wanted to first cover things I didn't watch. Things that at one point I maybe said that I would watch or I had planned to watch, but I just didn't. And maybe at some point I will, and maybe at some point we'll cover them. So let me know, should I watch these? Are there other things that I should watch? I didn't watch Shield Hero. I've heard that it's one of the best isekai ever. Even from my friends who hate isekai, they had to acknowledge that the show is pretty great. I expect it to just be really solid storytelling, well-animated, good characters, stuff like that. And I don't know, I suppose if I'm ever in the mood to watch an isekai, like a straightforward, taking itself seriously isekai, I'd probably check out something like this. But honestly, I haven't had that desire in quite a long time, so I'm not really expecting to anytime soon. The Promised Neverland, I have heard, is a really good adaptation, and I'm very happy for the fans of the manga and all the new fans that are probably coming in because of it. I would rather read the manga though, and I am planning at some point on reading the manga. So many people have told me to. So many people have said that it's one of the best shonen running right now, and I'm always in the mood to pick up another great shonen series. So I don't know. Hopefully, look forward to that. I'll have to find some place that has scans going back to the actual start. All the sites that I know carry it only go a few chapters back, so that's a little awkward. Anyways, so because of that, I didn't really have any interest in watching the anime. Maybe if I really, really like the manga, I'll go back and do that. But I'd rather read the manga first. Kaguya-sama, sort of the same thing. I've heard a lot of really good things about the manga. I watched the anime kind of on a whim. I just needed more things to watch on the plane ride home from Japan, and I liked it. I liked the characters. I liked the premise. I liked the sense of humor. I liked the structure of it. All of that was great, and the animation and stuff was pretty good too. But I just didn't really like the pacing of the anime. I often find with kind of anime adaptations that have this more rigid structure where it's like we're going to adapt these 3 chapters. It leads to kind of awkward pacing where manga chapters, even if they're the same page count, take drastically different lengths to read depending on the sort of story being told, right? So if you try to just map one chapter to 1/3 of an episode with that level of rigidity, you're going to run into like major pacing problems. And I don't like I can understand why they do it just for easiness' sake, but it's very disappointing to me when I see shows that stumble over this really kind of obvious mistake. So yeah, I just kind of found myself frustrated by some of the pacing, and I was like, I'd rather just read this. So again, please look forward at some point to reading Kaguya-sama, and it's on the list. It's a long list, but it's on the list. The Dororo adaptation of the Tezuka manga, I did not watch because I'm usually very skittish of Tezuka manga adaptations. I never really hear anything good about them. They seem to just kind of emerge as some greater cultural need. I need to make money, maybe. I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure who's been making them and who they're for. But they usually just kind of fade into the distance, and I expected that what it was is that they're made mostly for older Tezuka fans, not necessarily anime fans that are watching a whole bunch of other anime, but just someone's grandfather who remembers reading Tezuka comics in his youth and is excited to see them animated in any sort of form. But all of that doesn't seem to apply to this Dororo animation, which a lot of people seem to be saying is quite good. It's been getting good reviews, so I would like to watch it at some point. It seemed kind of too late in the season for me to bother picking it up then, but at some point I'd like to check it out. I'd also like to read the manga. That is a Tezuka manga that I haven't read yet, and I know that it's one of his classics, so maybe that'll be something we do on the channel too. I don't know. It's hard to find scans of those old Tezuka mangas. Typically, I'll end up just reading them in physical copies at a library or something, because a lot of them have been localized, even if not scanlated. Kakegurui, the sequel season. I started watching the first season and I really liked it, but I haven't finished it yet. So when I finish that, I'll probably go on and watch this. This Virtual-san wa Miteiru, I've heard is kind of funny, but I'm not really that into virtual YouTubers, so I'm not sure if I would really understand any of the jokes or any of the memes or anything like that. But I don't know. Any show that's like this shitposty, I feel like I want to connect with. I want to watch and understand. So I'm a little disappointed that I can't have that experience. Also, I meant to put Hulaing Babies on this list, and I think I forgot. At some point, I had said that I was going to watch that because it looked pretty interesting, and then I just didn't. I don't know why. I just didn't. So maybe I will sometime in the future. But all right. So with all of these covered, and then all the ones we just watched, there's still one show missing. One show we haven't talked about. But before we get to it, I wanna talk a little bit more about this scoring thing. The fact that I'm giving anime scores. Like, why am I giving scores? What is the point of this? So there's a few reasons that I think scores and reviews are kind of useful. First one is hype. That if you're watching or reading a review, it's kind of a way to put like an explosive exclamation mark at the end of it. If the score is really high or really low, it just sort of adds the dynamicism of the whole review, that you get to the end and it's not just like, oh, it really seems like you liked it, but like, whoa, 9, like it just kind of like hits you, you know? Um, and then if you're kind of taking the reviewer's scores seriously, and you find that your tastes align with this reviewer, it's a very easy way to kind of set up prioritization. That all other things being equal, if you just want to pick up some new series and you're like, well, I'll just see what he's given a 10 to, that's a pretty good function of the score being there in the first place. Like, just allowing yourself to have like a to-do list or a to-avoid list, without really having to break down opinions in any real investigative depth. And along those lines too, it's a good summary. Sometimes you don't have the time to read or watch an entire review. And if you are doing a good review, if it's like a nice, thorough, critical look at something, sometimes actually gleaming overall, did they like it or not? Would they recommend it or not? Is kind of difficult, because that is a much more sort of nuanced thing that's built on many, many layers of analysis. So being able to just skip to the part that has the score and say, okay, looks like they liked it. Maybe I'll check this out. Maybe I'll read the full review later. Or it doesn't look like it's that big a deal either way. It just doesn't seem interesting. I'll just move on. That's pretty useful too. So all of these things are based on the reviewer having social capital with their audience. Okay, all of them are based on the fact that there's some logic behind the tastes, that logic is consistent, and that if your tastes thus align with the reviewer's logic, then you can use the review score as like a predictive thing for your own enjoyment. If the reviewer is nonsensical, if it seems like their opinions don't line up with each other, if it seems like their tastes are totally arbitrary, then there's no way for the score to be at all useful to you, right? Like it just becomes like a number. So in service of that, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what gets good scores for me, why I score things highly. So the first kind of tier of this, which in my diagram is the largest tier, but is also on the bottom, is the artistic achievement of the text. And in here I'm going to use text as like an art student uses a text, which means the work of art in question, but it can be any medium, and it involves the totality of that piece of art within its medium. So it's not just the script. It's not just the part that can be a text file. The text is the entirety of the anime series in this case. So what makes a text a good artistic achievement? What does that mean? I would say how notable it is as an achievement in that medium. So this is kind of subjective. It's sort of based on your understanding of the medium, what you understand is important in that medium, how much of it you've experienced before, the things that kind of came after it sometimes affect that, which of course you can't really ascertain at the moment of that medium's creation, but it should be kind of universally justifiable. That is to say, you're pointing to things in the text that everyone at least has the potential to access. You're not saying this text is so great because it reminds me of my mother who died. That'll come later, but that you're saying this text is so great because of its fluid animation. This text is so great because of its inventive storytelling. This text is so great because the soundtrack is so beautifully recorded. Things like that. So here I think the main things we're looking for are novelty, how fresh it is, how it breaks the molds of the things before it, how it kind of ekes out new territory in the medium, but then also mastery. How well done is it compared to other things in the same genre or medium? Like how does it deliver on our expectations that already exist. So in anime, we're looking at things like the animation quality, of course, which isn't just necessarily the number of frames they jam in, but just overall how good does it look to watch these drawings move around. The music, of course, can be a major factor, voice acting too, the storytelling of it. Is it a compelling story? Is it a story that makes sense? Is it a story that we become invested in, or is it just kind of like a cheap excuse to move us to the titillating aspects of it? Is the characterization good? Are we interested in finding out more about the characters? Do we believe them as cohesive people? Not that these are necessarily the intents, but these are the sort of questions we can ask ourselves to try to figure out, do I like the characterization in the show? So that's the bottom layer. It comprises a whole lot of stuff about the text. And I think something that we're going to give a high score to has to do well in this area. The next area, which is emotional resonance, is actually more important. Like, if something is an amazing artistic achievement, but you're just bored throughout the whole thing, it just does not resonate with you at all, you don't feel a single thing about it, then that should not get a high score from you. That's not something that actually reflects your tastes. But at the same time, if it's just that for whatever reason, for a totally arbitrary personal thing, I completely bawl my eyes out watching a show that is not noteworthy in any other way, then I would also give it a low score because it's missing this kind of achievement foundation. Like, it's missing the things that you can actually point to and say, this is how it works, this is what makes it so good. So yeah, as I said, this is how much you're affected by those artistic qualities, just how emotional you get about the show. And this is extremely subjective, and you really can't, you don't need to justify it to anyone. Sometimes you can't even explain to yourself why it is something that hits you that hard. Ideally, you'd be able to point to aspects in the show that you really kind of resonate with, like things in the artistic achievement area that you notice are really affecting you, and that if the show didn't have those would be much worse to you. But it's not like you can necessarily say why they're doing that, like what kind of tender part of your body they were able to poke so precisely. And yet I think it's still very important to try. It's still I think a really important part of artistic critique to go into these sort of things, even if it involves a lot of introspection, and to pull them out. I think that's something that can make a really memorable critique and can really open up the appeal of a series and make that feeling a little more universal. But it's not like you need to. It's not like you can be forced to or anything, because you might not even know. And it's about kind of the richness of the emotion felt. That it's not necessarily like if you're really in a hysterical mood to begin with for whatever reason, and a show just becomes like gut-wrenchingly funny to you, and you're in that kind of punchy state where you can't stop laughing at something, that's great, and probably you'll really enjoy that show. But it might not be a particularly rich emotion, and it's probably one that's largely based on your state going into the show. Whereas another show that if you're just kind of in a neutral mood, maybe in a good mood, I don't know, you've just had a normal day, and then you sit down, and by the end of it, you're just like weeping, and you're on the verge of existential crisis, and it feels like everything has changed. Like, that's a very rich emotion. That's an emotion that has overwhelmed everything you had felt up until that point, and that's something where you can tell you're really emotionally resonating with it. So for anime, just like any other medium, there's a big range of emotions that we're going into expecting to feel. Happiness, that's a big one. I think a lot of people watch anime to kind of have like an escapist, happy feeling. But then also sadness. Sad anime are really beloved because sadness is a very rich emotion that feels very full and and complete, that doesn't cast away aspects of your life, but really embraces everything going on. Or just hilarity, just laughing, having a fun time, kind of losing yourself in it. I said earlier that if you're kind of in a punchy mood and something makes you laugh, that maybe that's not a huge indicator that it's a masterpiece. But if you're in a miserable mood and something is still managing to make you laugh, that's pretty impressive. There's something really going on there. Excitement too, you watch an action sequence, you watch a fight scene, you get pumped up, the adrenaline gets going. Or it could be the opposite, a complete kind of hypnotic trance, something so tranquil and beautiful that you just, the hours melt away as you're kind of cast along into this world. Then there's moe, and this is an emotion that I feel is quite unique to anime and manga and doesn't really pop up in a lot of other mediums, but we'll get to that later. So, these are our first two pillars of score justification. Well, not really pillars, sorry. Our first two layers, it's the opposite of pillars. This is built on top of this. But what is built even further on top of this? What is perhaps even more important than the emotions that you're feeling? Well, it's the morality of those emotions. And this is a big, very loaded word. And I don't want you to immediately start thinking that I'm going to turn all preachy here and say that it's only good Christian anime allowed or something like that. I'll break down a little more what I mean by this. Oh, I forgot to make this fade in. You get to see all of it at once. Anyways, so this is how the themes and lessons of the series teach you about the human condition, how they reach beyond the confines of just the show and make you kind of reflect upon or see the world a little differently going forward. So what we want is something that feels insightful, something that by the end of it you're like, oh, I can understand a little better why things are the way they are. So the kind of strength of that, it's not just necessarily how kind of complex and accurate an insight it is. If it's something that completely captures the human condition and says some truly profound and true things about how it is to live in our society, but it just sails right over your head or it bounces right off you and you're like, I don't care, then that doesn't really do too much. So it also has to be about the impact of it. And this could be the freshness of the idea. Maybe if it's the first time you've ever heard someone talk about this sort of thing, it can be kind of mind-blowing, and then it really sticks with you for quite a while. But also, if it has like a very convincing argumentative logic to it, I think it also can have quite a big impact. And this is where you would see kind of like books of philosophy or something. This is the thing that really makes them masterpieces, isn't necessarily because it's such a novel and mind-blowing idea or because it really emotionally resonates with you, but just because it is so convincing that if you read it and think about it and comprehend it, you find it undeniable, or at least compellingly cohesive. But of course, the emotional resonance is a huge part of this too, that if you're moved to tears by something, you probably will end up believing that that's a true thing. Oh, I thought there was another part. Well, whatever. Okay, so is morality important in art? I would say yes and no. Oh, this is the part where, yeah, sorry. I forgot what slide I put the next kind of step on. So, I don't want to come across as some sort of moral crusader that is saying that only art that makes you a better person should be allowed. Because I'd say most things are kind of morally banal. And especially in anime, I would say most things are just kind of like, did I give some examples here? I fight for my friends. How many times have you heard that? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's like a good thing to feel like you can do, stand up for the people you care about. But we've heard it like 10,000 times, so that when you hear it, unless it's like really resonating with you emotionally, it just is kind of like a moot point. You're like, oh, okay, of course they're going to say something like that. Or fun things are fun, which is really the defining lesson of so many slice of life anime. And each time I'm quite moved by the fact that fun things indeed turn out to be fun. But I wouldn't really necessarily say I'm having any sort of epiphany. I'm not really viewing the world differently after that, because I've already learned it like so many times from so many different after school clubs. um, and even when there is kind of a complex, profound moral lesson that makes you walk away from the text feeling like, oh, like I'm gonna see things a little differently now. That's kind of more just the cherry on top, I would say. Like, the thing must have already been pretty good for you to have had that serious an epiphany around it, for you to become that invested in it. It didn't really even need, like, even if for some reason you were incapable of thinking about it outside of that time you were directly engaging with it, you would still say that that was a good text. You would still say that it was a good experience that you had, just enjoying it in that moment, right? So, in that sense, it really doesn't seem like it should be that important, um, because you don't really necessarily have high expectations from it, especially in a medium like anime. And when it does happen to kind of hit you with something profound, you know that you weren't really going into it for that reason, and thus it seems a little irrelevant as to, or if not irrelevant, then just like, yeah, like a cherry on top. Like it's just kind of like a slight bonus, rather than what would make or break the show. And yet, on the other hand, it does kind of make or break the show. Oh wait, no, this is something else too. Is that I would say though that when you look back at your all-time most favorite things in any medium, you'll probably find that a lot of them succeeded for you, that became so important to you because of this morality, because of its connection to your life outside of the text. At least that's true for me. I would say that my all-time favorite texts in any medium have this in common, that my favorite thing about it is how it made me view the world after I had experienced the text. And then this is very key too. It's a cherry on top, but it can also be a turd on top. And while a cherry on top is nice but not necessary, a turd on top just ruins the whole thing. So something that's morally unacceptable, something that makes you just kind of repulsed that someone could possibly see the world this way, something that afterwards, if you tried to see the world differently through that lens, you would find it just incompatible, that you would find it untrue and oversimplifying or just distorted or whatever. This can definitely ruin an entire text alone, just being completely morally unacceptable. So why is that? Like, why, outside of the kind of base emotional reaction that we might have if we see something that's morally disagreeable, why is it actually like bad? Is that not just kind of a matter of taste? Because then it kind of seems like we're just working back down to the layer of emotional resonance and just say, well, this has like a very distasteful resonance. Or moreover, isn't it possible that you have a show that or that emotionally resonates with you, that you find yourself very invested in, you're laughing, you're crying, or whatever, but then at the end, when you kind of think about it some more, you're like, oh, I actually disagree totally with the message of that series. Are we really expected to walk away then hating that series and kind of undoing all of that effect? So let's break this down a little bit more. So there's this philosopher, or this critic, Gout, that I heard about first on this Philosophy Tube video about fan service in anime. And their kind of thesis is that art that tries to espouse some moral belief that you disagree with inherently fails because it's unconvincing. So that if you kind of think of the ultimate thrust of the media or of the text to change your mind about something, to make you see the world in whatever way, if it doesn't convince you of that, then you can kind of say it's failed in its goal, and you can't really call it good art because of that. So that's one perspective, okay? And it kind of, again, places morality at the top of this hierarchy, that even if everything else was a masterpiece, even if everything else was well done and emotionally resonant, if it's still failing in its ultimate argument, then you can't really say it's any good. Yeah, and again, it kind of works back down to emotional resonance, that you're left with dissonance, the opposite of resonance. You're left out of sync with the artists that produced the text, because you just disagree with them. You just cannot see eye to eye to them with them. But this requires you to figure out the moral belief that the text is espousing. Okay. And sometimes that's pretty obvious. Sometimes that requires a lot of analysis and nuance and kind of tying together of themes. But either way, as soon as you're kind of arguing based on this thesis, you're in ascension putting words into the artist's mouth. And that's in violation of Dota theory. Whoops, I hit the back arrow. That's in violation of Barth's Dota theory, or death of the author theory. My friend pointed out to me that death of the author and Dota. So, Dota theory, or death of the author theory, says that the artist's intent doesn't matter, that all should be contained within the text. And this is an extremely landmark critical theory that Barth's outlined in his famous essay, Death of the Author. And I think there's a lot of, I would be really remiss to go against it. Like, I think this has a lot of value, that you basically just assume any author is dead. You can't go back and get their opinion or ask them why, or ask, what did you really mean by this? You just have to infer it from the text. And to me, I think that is the way to go. So then, how do we kind of assess the morality of an art, of an art form? So yeah, how do we find out what the text is espousing really? Like, without this idea of saying, well, this is the intended message, this is what they intended to have as the change that this art affects into the world, how are we kind of looking at the effects of the text? How are we looking at that kind of outward part without violating Dota theory and trying to put words into the artist's mouth? So what I recommend is like a holistic approach, that is taking both the text and what we know of the author and what we know of the contemporary culture in which it was created, just everything that can be considered, throw it kind of into the text as kind of contextual knowledge around the text. And this situate it in the opportunities they had in its creation, the sort of things that they were able to do, the sort of things that they struggled to do, the sort of things that go across cultural norms and lines that the text kind of imposes onto the world by going past those. And I made this little diagram here to try to explain what I mean. So the other thing, I actually meant to add another line about this. Okay, so the other thing that's maybe unfair when we start talking about kind of putting things into the artist's mouth is that if we're working backwards from the text to try to figure out the artist's intent, that assumes that everything in the text the artist was trying to say pertains to actual society and the human condition. When really there's a lot of things in text that are just kind of purely fantastical, that are purely reflections of the artist's own idiosyncrasies and such, and don't necessarily represent any sort of outward connection between the art and the world. So for a basic example, think of an artist who's bad at drawing, and they're trying to make this manga, but there's all these like quirks of their art style that really are unignorable and really come through. And you wouldn't say that any sort of message the series has is hinged on that, because that's just kind of a limitation of the medium, or limitation of the artist within the medium. So there we're looking at the struggles and stuff of their creation. And conversely, there's other things that I would call like reward functions, or fan service, I guess is another term, that although looking at them in the broader context of society will definitely allow you to kind of make meaning from it and connect it to that society as like, well, why did they put so many boob shots in there? The artist and kind of the experience that an uncritical viewer would have, a viewer that's able to kind of turn their mind off for those segments, is just the titillation of looking at boobs. And Joyce, my favorite author of all time, has this wonderful quote about how the art is what falls between the pornographic and the aesthetic. So if we kind of both take away the meaningless facets that are just kind of the aesthetic consequences of its creation, and then we also take away the parts that are purely fantastical, pornographic, then we're kind of looking for this like juicy center. Okay, so we have this ball here that says the human condition. It's not the scale. If it was the scale, it would be unfathomably huge compared to the circles that we're going to lay on top of it. One of which is the artist's intent. And we don't really know what is in the circle and what isn't. We don't really know how big the circle is or anything like that. But we likely assume that in a lot of works in a lot of mediums, there are things that come through in the text that aren't part of the artist's intent. All right? Sorry. They are part of the artist's intent. They are part of like what was deliberately put into the text, but they don't necessarily pertain to the artist's view on the human condition. They're not part of the moral thrust of the show or the text necessarily. So our justifiable critical response to intent situated within society, that is to say, you can't see it because, there we go. The justifiable critical response to intent situated within society. I couldn't fit it inside the circle. That is to say, the meaning we make of the text based on the text, not based on our own projections, not based on nothing, but based on the text within society, does contain everything. There's nothing that we aren't able to relate back to the human condition. Because as I said, we're treating this holistically and we're viewing everything kind of comprised, shoved back into the text, right? So I don't know, what's a good example? Let's look at something like, well, fan service is a decent example. Let's say there's a show with a ton of fan service, okay? So the artist's intent is to tell a story about humanity to some extent, to teach you about how they see the world. But then the boobs and stuff, likely they just throw that in as a bonus. That's fan service. That's something for the reader to just enjoy in a totally different pornographic dimension than everything else that's going on. All right, so this is the main chunk of the plot, and this is the boobs. Okay, as critical viewers, our complete understanding of the text involves everything we think that the artist is saying about the human condition, but then also the fact that the artist is putting in fan service also says something about the human condition. It also reflects the art's perspective on society. Okay, all right. Does all of that make sense? But I think we can't ignore the fact that this exists, this little region here. So I would call this the fantasy element. And I started with fan service as kind of a specific application because I wanted rhetorically to make you understand something a little broader and I think more significant about this. So in any series that has supernatural elements that deals with fantasy things, fantasy creatures, fantasy society, whatever, we automatically kind of dismiss elements of that from pertaining to the show's overall moral message. So I'll give you a good example. We're now going to turn to Zizek, Slavoj Zizek, a philosopher that I'm quite interested in. I don't always agree with him, but I think in his ability to do kind of psychoanalysis and investigation into popular stories and kind of unraveling the reason behind their popularity and etc. He says some very interesting things. So In, I believe this is The Pervert's Guide to Cinema, he talks about Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, and I guess I'll put this link in the description so you don't have to type this out. But this is a link to, or if you just Google or YouTube Zizek Birds, you'll probably find it. So he says the first key to horror films, to understanding horror films, say let's imagine the same story but without the horror element. So this makes sense. And he talks about the horror element as a foreign dimension intrudes that literally tears apart reality. So that if we're interested in reality and kind of the stories, what it's saying about reality, then we have to remove this foreign dimension to kind of get us back to what is happening without it. So this makes sense, right? The lesson of The Birds, of Hitchcock's The Birds, can't possibly be watch out for the crazy birds. Because birds aren't crazy. Birds aren't going to come out and attack us. And yet you'll probably walk away from that movie because it's quite a well-done movie and it has a lot of emotional resonance and artistic achievement with a kind of a moral shift in you, a different way of sort of seeing certain interpersonal relationships and viewing certain character traits and stuff, blah, blah, blah. And it's because of what's behind the attacks of the crazed birds. It's about what's happening without the crazed birds attacking. Then he breaks it down in this video clip, and it's quite interesting. I recommend checking it out to get a better idea. So that's easy enough with horror, and it's quite fun to kind of look at your favorite horror movie and imagine the same plot happening, but without whatever supernatural elements or whatever totally horrific elements, and kind of see, you know, how are the characters going to clash, and not just horror, but any movie that kind of has, or any text that has this kind of element. He does another really fascinating segment about the Titanic, imagining the movie Titanic. What if it didn't hit the iceberg? What if it didn't sink? Like, what would have happened then? What can we kind of learn from this? Anyways, but for a slice of life anime, for an anime that doesn't have any supernatural elements, what is the fantastical element? And what, conversely, are the honest emotions? Like, what are the things that would have been happening were it not for this fantastical element? So how do we determine what the fantastical element is? And let's say for consistency's sake, because we already talked about fan service, that there is no overt fan service. There is nothing that's sheerly pornographic. So let's go back to emotional resonance, because we were talking about kind of the emotional impact. So let's think about The Birds. If The Birds was just the character drama, and it didn't have the supernatural birds attacking, then we would still have kind of these emotions of, I don't know, like humor in some scenes and sadness and tension, but we wouldn't have the thrills. We wouldn't have the excitement or the terror or whatever like that. So with anime, let's kind of break down, like, where are the fantastical emotions? So we already looked at this stuff. Happiness, sadness, we can imagine these as being totally non-fantastical. Hilarity, of course, real life is often funny. Excitement, sure, I mean, this is probably one that a lot of series would go if we're kind of cutting out these fantastical elements. If we're removing the Titans from Attack on Titan, say, it probably wouldn't be that exciting of a series, but you can still kind of be caught up in the character drama that I'm sure would ensue there. The hypnotic state, yeah, I can imagine that. But then there's one that falls quite outside of all of this, which is, of course, moe. So what's up with moe? What is moe? And of course, it comes from the word moer, to mean to bud or to sprout, but also to be aroused, and it's a homophone for being inflamed. It's a feeling that we often hear about being held towards fictional characters, but what I'm wondering is, inherently, can we say that moe has to be held towards fictional characters, or at least fictionalizations of real people? And it's kind of based on this idea of idealization, that the endearing factors of the characters are really emphasized. They're cute, you kind of want to protect them, but at the same time, sometimes you want them to protect you. There's kind of a paradoxical understanding of moe. where a lot of characters can have conflicting traits, and yet the brain is able to kind of hold them in cognitive dissonance peacefully. Adoration, I think, is a very key part of moe, both in the like, oh, that's so adorable, but then, also, oh, come let us adore him, this sort of religious sense. Again, just a totally idealized person that even if they have flaws, the flaws are ideal. They're like the perfect flaws for that character. This video is now over an hour long, so we're just going to skip through these next slides. But in summary, it's something that you can only hold towards impossible people, that it requires this cognitive dissonance fusing of a Frankenstein's monster, basically, of all of the desirable parts of the character, all the parts you like, none of the parts you don't like, made up of both canonical, fanonical, personal understandings of the character, a character that is iconified through many different forms of representation. That to me is what births the feeling of moe, and thus what makes moe an inherently fantastical emotion, an emotion that only really makes sense falling outside of that circle, an emotion that is targeted towards things that can't possibly be reflected in the human condition because they simply don't exist. And as I said, we can then encapsulate the desire to create these things and the desire to kind of like focus on them as part of the human condition, are a critical thing then moving fully within that circle. But it does kind of separate it morally from the overall thrust of the show, and is thus more situated within the struggles and opportunities of the contextual creation of the series, rather than necessarily being entirely within text itself. So for the purpose of rating, this starts to become interesting. So much more on this on a later date. Maybe if people are interested, we can talk more about moe and talk about the inherent fantastical nature of moe. But for now, we'll return to the idea of how do we score moe series? what is up with that? But there are still more questions. Like, this is kind of where I hit a wall. So is the feeling of moe mentally healthy? This is a big question. This is one that probably will require longitudinal psychological studies of many people in Japan, which, as far as I know, has not been done because Japan isn't really completely on the ball with mental health, unfortunately. Is moe kind of just making the most out of a doomed situation? Is it allowing people to have this kind of experience of love when otherwise they would go their whole lives without it? Or is it dooming people itself? Is the reason why people won't have truly reciprocal love in their life because they're caught up in moe? I don't know. Is it creating cult-like behavior? Is it leading people to behave irrationally and to make decisions that are not in their best interest? Is it true that anime is a worldwide decentralized leaderless cult? I don't know. More on this later, maybe. And should art be responsible to promote mentally healthy behavior? Like, what is mentally healthy in the first place? Does it involve kind of alignment to society? What if you reject society? What if you're not happy with the way society is? And thus making well-adjusted people that can calmly live out their lives could be seen as extremely immoral. Moreover, we still haven't really answered the question, is art responsible for making morally righteous things, or is that in the first place kind of too loaded of a question? Also, if we remove this kind of fantastic reward function from a text, if we take out the fan service, if we take out the action scenes or the horrific elements, the things that kind of get you into the seat, does it still map to the real world people doing the work? So for an example, you can't become a Pokemon master in real life. You play the Pokemon games, they're often very moralistic. They teach you all sorts of lessons about overcoming adversity, teaming up, caring for the less fortunate, all sorts of things like this. Things that in many ways mirror the real life journeys of the people playing those games as they, go off to high school. I'm just kind of guessing based on the average age of Pokemon players, like the kind of challenges that they'll experience in life, you can actually draw upon the lessons of Pokemon if it has been an emotionally resonant show or game franchise for you. But you'll never become a Pokemon master. Those things will never actually help you become a real life Pokemon master because Pokemon, unfortunately, are not real, at least here in 2019. So, is it okay, or like, does it still work if we kind of disregard those elements? If we say, well, that's not really important to the series, is it like fair? Like, is it? And can we situate this text with reward meaningfully within the human condition, or is the reward functionally inherently purely textual? This is kind of the big question we've been wrestling with. And the other thing is like, is the text with reward, is the reward part even textual? Can you even really situate it within the text? Like, here's an extreme example. Let's say there was a TV show that when you finished watching an episode would magically conjure a delicious chocolate into your hands. So you eat the chocolate, you get the endorphins, you get that pleasurable chocolate eating sensation, and it makes you like the show more. Like Pavlovianly, you just start to enjoy watching the show more because your brain associates it with eating the chocolate. But I wouldn't say the chocolate is part of the text. I wouldn't say, well, I don't know. Would I say that? Because whatever processes magically conjure it up into your room must have something to do with the text. It's like, I gotta really figure this out, right? I mean, if scores are tied to social capital and that each score you make kind of compounds on all the other scores you give, and I still have these really major questions about kind of how shows function morally, how shows relate to the real world. Like, should I just hang up my hat? Should I really be giving scores out? But then I said this a few times: social capital. You know, the idea of people honoring the kind of goodwill you've built up with them by taking you seriously and hearing out your opinions. That doesn't sound like anime. That doesn't sound like any anime fan I've ever known. You think anime is about accumulating and utilizing social capital? I beg to differ. I would say, and this is something else I want to talk about at more length in another video, but in many ways, anime has remained the medium that is most against social capital, most depleting of social capital just by your sheer association with it. So is there not something even more important to think about when I'm giving scores, especially scores for anime? Not just hype, not just prioritization, not just summary, but allowing for the self-sabotage of the very social capital which the scoring system both builds and requires by memeing it into irreverence with unresolvable superpositions of serious and unserious scores. Yes, this is really the important one. And above this, above artistic achievement, above emotional resonance, above morality, is there something not even more important when it comes to determining how to assign a score? That's right. It's stupid name puns. So now I submit to you. What a 10? More like, what a 10?